Hi, and welcome to Master Your Fishing. In Series 1, we went through the methods and tactics required to help you be a match fishing master. In Series 2, we're going to be going into much greater detail to help you master those fish. So join me in just a sec. In this episode, we'll be looking at cold water F1 fishing, and in particular, targeting these fish with one of my favourite baits, the humble maggot. We'll be looking at the areas we need to target these fish, combined with how this can change during the course of the day, the different feeding patterns employed and why, the rigs required to present the baits, and also the little tricks that you can employ to get the best from each swim. You join me today at Partridge Lakes near Warrington, the home of the F1 in the north, on the Covey complex, and in particular we're on Covey 3 today. All of the lakes are the same. They have a uniform depth, which is approximately 6 foot down the middle, and then 2 uniform slopes either side, which shelve up to about 2.5 foot of water. And I'm going to show you how to catch the fish in these venues in the cold. There are a couple of key principles that I like to keep to when targeting these type of venues in the cold, and that's how the fish are going to behave at the start of the match, during the match, and at the end of the match. Now for me, I like to keep things very simple and feed 2 areas. The first one being a cross, and this is going to be in around 3 to 4 foot of water, and I'll explain why. At the start of any match, in the cold water, the fish are going to be in a dormant state, i.e. a state where they're probably shoaled together and not wanting to feed. And that is sort of like across to the far side. When you sit down on any of these venues, you need to categorise each area in your swim as whether it will be a place where fish will naturally sit when they're not feeding, or where they'll come to and feed. And the cross line is somewhere they will naturally back off to, congregate in a ball, and that's where we're going to target them at the start. Now, to target the fish across here, when they're in that state, we're going to look to fish at either 3 foot or 4 foot. The reason for that is, during that dormant state where they're not feeding, fish will, or F1s and carp shall I say, sorry, will sit in about 3.5 foot. And by fishing in 3 foot or 4 foot, they don't have to swim very far at all from where they feel comfortable to pick up the bait. They're either going to look upwards or look downwards, but not swim very, very far in the water column to actually eat the morsels of bait. So what I generally do is mark on my top kits 3 foot or 4 foot, set the float to those depths, and then go and find it with the plummet. I'm not looking towards a feature and actually plumbing the depth there. I'm actually physically finding the depth that I want to fish in. And that's one of the key principles of catching the cold water F1s. Because we're fishing on a shelf, it's very important to accurately fish, which is where the numbering system on these Middy poles come in great handy. So I know now that if I hold number 11, and I'm pointing it towards the stump of the tree straight in front of me, that I'm fishing perfectly in the right depth. Accuracy is really important when fishing on the shelf. You can't be having loads of line laying on the bottom because you will not see a bite. And likewise, you don't want to be sitting for long periods of time with the hook bait off the bottom, because that's unnatural and you won't get a bite also. So once you've plumbed up a line, we need to understand the feeding. Now, as I've explained, at the start of the session, the fish are not going to be feeding or eating much bait. You're basically trying to attract the odd fish at a time to pick up your hook bait. So you're going to be feeding somewhere between 2 to 10 maggots. Anything more than that is too much, and you'll result in the fish pushing out of the peg sooner because they get spooked off by bait, or resulting in line bites where you're not actually connecting anything. Now, line bites are a great way to sort of work out what's going on in your peg. If you don't know what a liner is, what it basically is a false indication of when a fish bumps into the line, registering an indication on the float tip. These are normally slower than normal bites, so you can normally tell what a liner is, but ultimately, all the indications that you see on a float gives you a clue as to what's happening in the peg. And the key to catching on this line is to feed minimal bait, lay the rig in accurately, and catch what fish are there, because what will happen is the fish will back off from where you're catching them. And by having line bites, you know when there's some fish present. If you're not getting indications, it's a key indicator to plumb up a new line, because 2 hours in the wrong spot is worse than 5 minutes in the right spot with this type of method. It's very instant, you'll get instant results, and it's a brilliant way to start off a session. So we're going to start the session now. At this point, we've not put any bait in anywhere else at all. I've found 3.5 foot across, and I've actually bumped a fish at the start of this session with the plummet, which has told me that there's a fish there, and that's where I'm going to start. And it's another thing, just any clue that you see to where the fish are, be it bubbles, be it fish topping, be it whether you hit a fish with a plummet at the start, which can happen, that's where you need to fish. With this across line, you are trying to find the fish rather than the other way around. They will not come to you, you're going to them. So that's a real tip that you need to follow. So all I'm going to do is drop in, line up with my far bank marker, and I'm going to tap in 5 maggots. Now it doesn't sound like a lot of bait, but that's more than enough to get you a fish. And that's all we're trying to do on this line. So we tap those maggots in, and we're just going to fish very accurately and nail it to the shelf and just wait for an indication. Now if you don't get a bite within 2, maybe 3 minutes, it's worth tapping in a few more maggots, be it 2, be it 3, because you want something falling through the water to try and attract a fish from the shoal, just to put its head down and pick up your hook bait. Sometimes it's best to feed 10 maggots in one go. Sometimes it's best to feed 5 lots of 2, just to keep that bait falling through the water. It's all about trial and error on the day. But it's important to not obviously at all, but it's important to keep track on how much bait you're feeding across. Because say, for example, in a 10-minute period, you've put 10 maggots in and that's got you a bite, then you'll know when it comes to the track line, which we'll talk about later, that the amount of bait that you need to feed basically. So if you feed in once every 40 minutes, you'd feed 40 maggots basically, because you fed 10 in 10 minutes, if that makes sense. So everything's intertwined on the day and hand in hand. And there we go, we're into a fish. You notice then, we've been in for less than a minute and we've had a bite, albeit an eyed in this instance. And ultimately, that's what this fire line is all about. Small amounts of bait, accurate fishing, quick response. If you're not getting a response within 5-10 minutes, you're unlikely to catch, so you move to a different area. And another thing to do with F1s, or to remember with F1s, shall I say, is that they are a shoal species. And one thing that I always take into account is what the fish do when you hook them. So what I mean by that is, if you hook a fish and it runs to the right, it's likely that that fish is trying to swim back to its shoal members. And it's happened more times than not to be coincidence that the direction in which the fish will run will tell you where to fish next. Sometimes it's to the left, sometimes it's to the right, but definitely take into account which way the fish go when you hook them. It'll give you another clue as to where to fish. Now the thing with fishing on the shelf is you always want to lay the rig away from the shelf and then let it fall towards it. And that's another way of keeping very accurate to your hook bait. You don't want any loops in the line with it laying over depth, etc. You want a nice straight line from your float to your hook bait with it laying on the bottom, and that's the best way to get accurate bite registration. There is no golden rule with how many lines to fish when fishing in this way, because sometimes you'll drop in on one line and catch all day. Other times you'll drop in and catch 1, maybe 2 at a time. It's all about just staying in contact with the fish. It's kind of like a chess game in winter. So sometimes you'll plumb up a foot away from your previous line, never feed that one again and carry on catching. And other times, and this is ideal, you can get 2 areas going at either side of your peg, and that's what's known as bouncing the fish basically, where you'll feed one area, catch a fish, and go to the other line, catch a fish, and it's a way of prolonging your catching period basically. But like I said, there is no golden rule. I've at times fed up to 10 spots during a winter session, and other times you feed 1 or 2. It's reading what's happening on the day and then reacting to suit. To me, it's the pure essence of watercraft, really, cold water F1 fishing. You are reading everything that's happening in your peg and making decisions to suit. Although the rigs and the feeding is very straightforward, the actual fishing can be quite complicated at times. It really keeps you on your toes. One thing to note when fishing in this way is that you start heading off down the far bank, that you're not going to go into one of your opponent's swims. Some venues only allow you to go to the next platform, whereas others allow you to go halfway between you and the next angler. But it's important not to go past that point and start taking fish out of an opponent's peg, because they won't be happy. So this line's gone pretty much to plan. We've had a real burst of fish at the early part of the session where I've caught very quickly, and it's gradually tailed off. And with this eyed, it's going to signal me going down the middle and trying to catch an F1 from down the track. Down the track is the term given to fishing down the middle of these Snake Lake canals. Now, it's not a line that I like to feed straight from the off. I like to gauge how the fish are behaving, how many numbers of fish are in the peg before I decide on how much bait to feed. And that's basically just so I don't put too much bait in and kill the swim. With catching some fish early, and with it being a slightly milder day than it has been for the last few weeks, I've decided to put around 100 maggots in, around half hour to 40 minutes into the session. I then didn't go on it for another half hour, fed another 100 maggots, and then after about an hour I've had my first look. And you know, it's not been great to begin with, but you know, it's starting to build, and it's a line that will get better during the course of any session. Here at Partridge in the matches, depending on the time of year, I'd look to catch a little burst, maybe an hour and a half into the session, 2 hours in, and then it will die, and then you might get a good run in the last hour. But that run can be really prolific late on in these cold water days, and you can put a decent part of your weight together in a very short space of time. Let's show you how I do it. With the weather still being cold and the water still being clear, this middle line I've decided to fish around 8 or 9 metres away from me. Now the reason for this is I just feel with the clarity of the water and the cold temperature, it's going to give the fish more confidence to settle over my bait than what they would do if I was feeding closer, which is what I'd expect to be doing if it was a lot warmer and the fish were feeding harder. Now, depending on your venue, it's depending on how you actually feed this line. Now, for putting good weights together and catching lots of fish, I always like either feeding with a catapult or out of the hand. But on a venue such as Partridge, which gets some of the most angling pressure that any lake in the country really gets, I mean, it gets match fished about 5 times a week. I firmly believe that at times when the fish aren't 100% on the feed, the noise of the bait going in can actually be off-putting to them. So I find here at Partridge that actually cupping in and kindering bait is a lot more effective than making the noise at this time of year. So that is the reason why I fed with a big pot, and I'm going to go in over the top with about 25 maggots out of a cup. A lot of people get confused about how to feed this line or how much bait. Now, again, for me, there's a couple of key things to look for with this, and generally it comes with the indications that you see on your float. And by indications, I'm talking about liners, bites that you don't connect with. If, for example, you are getting bites straight away after you've fed, but then hooking no fish, it's a key sort of indicator that the bait that you're feeding out of your cup isn't actually getting to the bottom. The F1s are feeding and eating the maggots before there's a little bed and a little trap of maggots around your hook bait. And in this instance, the key thing to do would be to actually increase your bait to make sure that there's enough maggots on the bottom to get 2 or 3 fish feeding in and around your float and ultimately picking up your hook bait. So in that instance, the thing to do would be to increase the amount of bait. Let me just put this rig back in again. On the flip side of things, if you're waiting 5, maybe 10 minutes to start getting some indications, and then that results in a bite after a long period of time of getting liners, for example, that would say that you've got too much bait on the bottom and there's too much choice. So it's taking the fish quite a while to actually pick your hook bait out of the loose offerings. So the simple thing to do in this instance would be to cut back on the bait. And the other thing to remember is this isn't a fixed rule that happens once you've got to say 18 maggots, for example, whether that's getting you the best indications. That will change during the course of the day as well. So it's a constant, every time you go in with this, you are basically starting a mini match. And once you've hooked a fish, you're then starting again. It's just all about keeping in touch with what the fish are doing and how much they're feeding to get the best out of the peg. Like I said, it's all about adjusting the amount of bait each put in to make sure that you're getting bites in a quick time scale. In pure essence, you're trying to get a small amount of bait around your hook bait, where a small number of grazing fish will pick your hook bait out within a 1 to 2 minute period. And this will change during the course of the session, normally getting better towards the end as either the match comes to a close or the water temperature's warming up. This come after 2 minutes after feeding, which is a perfect sort of time scale that I'm after to confidently know that the fish are feeding in my swim. Now it's worth remembering that this line is something that needs nurturing during the day. And by nurturing, that means you're going to go in, catch 1, maybe 2 fish at times, and then you'll have to come off it. Because if you sit fishing it, you'll actually put any further fish off. There's only a few times during the course of the session where you'll be able to drop in and constantly catch fish. And that's towards the back end of the session. Again, it's winter and it's all about nicking fish off each line and resting them to get the best out of your peg. Now for me, the best way to lay your rig in is to feed first, and then I try and flick the rig past my bait and let it fall on a tight line back towards me. And just like fishing across, where I'm trying to keep a straight line between my float and the hook bait for bite registration, I'm doing exactly the same as that down the middle by flicking the rig away from me and keeping a tight line to the hook bait from the float. The F1s are very delicate feeders, and if you don't do that and you've got like an amount of line on the bottom, you sometimes will not see the bite. Oh, missed one then. A question I get asked a lot is, like, are you fishing on the deck? And for me, with maggots, the answer is yes. In the winter, there are a few occasions where you'll catch by having your hook bait off the bottom, sometimes with maggots, but mainly with bread. With this tactic, this is definitely something that I'd like to fish with the hook bait physically touching the lake bed. So when I plumb up, I'm looking to see a little bit of the stem beneath the float. I'm looking to plumb up basically to the bottom of the body. And that way I'm always confident that my hook bait is touching the bottom. So for reference, you're looking to see where my thumb is, that's where the top of the water should be, in my opinion, to get the best presentation. Now, I've just caught an eye there, which illustrates that although I've just told you how I like to lay my rig in for F1s, there are other ways to do it. So because I've just caught an eye, I'm going to try and catch a fish on the drop now, which means I'm going to lay my rig sideways from my pole tip and then hold a tight line all the way down to the bottom. This is a brilliant way of laying your rig in to catch fish on the drop. I don't think it's great when there's F1s in the peg because it can lead to foul hookers, etc. But when some silverfish turn up, it's definitely worth laying your rig in this manner. not seen any bites, so it's quite clear to me that all the fish are congregated on the bottom. Now, a lot of people lift and drop a hell of a lot when fishing like this, and it's not something I'm a huge fan of doing. Although I'm sort of fishing bait through the water at times, i.e. feeding with a catapult or out of the hand, depending on the venue, all I'm ever trying to create is a little bed of bait, like a little trap on the bottom of maggot. And by lifting and dropping, I think I'm actually missing out on what I'm trying to achieve, because when the fish come into the peg, there's a chance that my hook bait isn't actually on the bottom because I'm putting it back in again, if that makes sense. When I feed, I'll generally have the rig in and not move it for a long period of time, which lends itself to a wire float, which I'll come onto in a bit when I cover the rigs. See, another thing that I do that I'm not always conscious of, but it's something that I've always done, is I generally count to a minute in my head when I'm fishing, and then I'll count to a minute again for a second minute or a third minute. And it helps me gauge how much bait to put in the peg. So for example, if I've put 30 maggots in and it's taken 3 minutes to get a bite, I'll try cutting down to 20 and see if I can get a bite in 2 minutes. And that's just a way of gauging what bait's in your peg and how quickly it's being eaten. It's not an exact science, but it does help you get a greater understanding of how much bait the fish are feeding and how much you need to put in to get the quickest bite response. Although feeding and timing, in my opinion, are the most important things for cold water F1 fishing, there's no doubt that rigs are extremely important too. So let's run you through my setups. So we'll start with the top kits. Personal preference, I always go for, with this type of fishing, the short F1 kits coupled with a short number 4 to get the stiffness of the pole. At the top end, this is my track rig. So I've got the larger of one of the Grip Flex pots to allow me to feed somewhere between 25 to 50 maggots, depending on the temperature and how good the swim is on the day. The elastic of choice today is the Flame Reactor Core. This is a new elastic from Middy and it's fast becoming my favourite for this style of fishing. Very, very soft, which is important for this style of fishing. I want to be able to hook into fish, have plenty of elastic come out, pull them away from the shoal, but in a soft and sort of controlled manner so the fish aren't darting out of the peg. It's important that they leave the peg in a sort of controlled, normal manner. The more scatty they are, the more they're going to disperse the shoal members, the less bites you're going to get. Main line, it's cold water, but I don't shy away. I don't buy into the light lines that people tend to do. I've got 018. I just want rigs that are robust, that I don't need to keep retying. The stiffness of the line keeps the rig straighter anyway, and if push comes to shove, I can put any hook length on this rig and still use it to catch big carp as well as roach. Note the number 6 back shot. I like a nice big stable back shot to hold the rig into place. It's going to be there for a while, especially in the cold water, so you want a nice heavy back shot that, you know, keeps everything in the right place. I'm using one of the new Middy wrap floats. This is the wire, which has actually got the Zytonol bendy wire for robustness. The great feature on these new floats is they've got a wrap round just underneath the eye, and what this stops happening is when you pull out of a fish, the line generally goes at a funny angle towards the float, and that's where your eye gets ripped out. With the inclusion of this just makes sure that your floats are going to last a lot longer, because at some point you will pull out of a fish and it puts a lot of pressure on your eye. You've got 3 float rubbers. Please note that I've sort of darkened this out for a reason. I'm sort of fishing down the middle and it's a white background. I find that, you know, black stands out far better for me on like a light surface than any other colour. Now in the winter it's also worth noting that you are dotting down to a pimple. If you have got the full float bristle showing, at times you will not see the bites. They're so delicate, even though they're big fish, that you need to be down to a pimple. And every indication you should really strike at this time of year. And the size of float, even though I'm fishing in nearly 6 foot here, is a 4x12. I like a nice light float where I can with maggot fishing. The heavier float, I just think there's more chance of the fish resisting or feeling the resistance and rejecting the bait. So where I've not got lots of silverfish, like this venue for example, I'll fish a really light float, even in the deepest of water. We come down to the business end, and the shotting couldn't be simpler. I've got 2 number 10s and then 3 number 12s beneath that. I want a nice slow fall in that bottom third on this track rig. I think that's really important because the fish will sit above the hook bait and watch it go down. So a nice slow natural fall gives you more chance of fooling the wary fish. And then that goes down to an 010 bottom and a size 18 6313 hook. And that, folks, is my track rig. Nothing complicated, nice and straightforward. Like I said, I've got a wire stem on here. The reason for that is I don't want a huge amount of weight down the line. I want a light float, but the wire gives me the extra stability to hold it still for long periods of time while I'm waiting for a bite. That could be in the water for up to 5 minutes, maybe even longer without an indication, and I need to hold it in place. So let's have a look at the across rig. I've got the same setup as down the track. I've got the short 4, the F1 Pro and the flame reactor core. 018 mainline, number 6 back shot. Again, a 4x12 float, one of the Middy wrap floats. Again, exactly the same size as down the middle, a 4x12. The only difference on this one is the shotting pattern slightly different. I've got a spread bulk of number 10s, 5 number 10s, and the reason for this is we're fishing on more of a slope, so that spread bulk not only gives a natural fall but helps me keep a tight line for when I'm actually laying on the slope. Very simple rigs, 010 6313 again. And the other thing to note is, like I said, I've marked the depth. That's 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot, 4 foot, and I've set the rig to just over 3 foot, and I went and found that depth. So here we are now at the end of the session, having a good run of fish. It's late on in the day and the fish are now finally feeding down the middle. Gone to a typical sort of cold water F1 day really. We've had a run of fish at the beginning across, that's then died off. We've gone searching around for fish, picked up a few during the day, and now we're having a strong finish down the middle. And that's F1 fishing in a nutshell. Thanks for watching.